Most of us have heard that saying, sailing is 99% calm and wonderful, 1% absolutely terrifying. When I was reading this story, I was astounded at how what was a beautiful passage on a wonderfully prepared boat went from a few small things going wrong to a big thing, followed by an even bigger one, and then even bigger. The escalation raised my blood pressure just reading this, and I learned something very important. Platino was a 66-foot single-mast boat built in New Zealand by a company called Yachting Developments. This is back in 1997-98. These folks make fairly large boats, monohulls, cats, and power boats, even super yachts. They've been around a long time. Platino had a sordid beginning when a fire broke out in the shipyard when she was being built and was sold at a reduced price, but the new owners spent millions on a full refit. Before you can leave New Zealand, this is important to know, the government there insists on a full inspection, and Platino was inspected and exceeded all expectations for ocean travel, and it was awarded the highest ratings. The new owners and crew, including one of her builders, were making a passage north from New Zealand when this story really starts. Platino was headed north with the wind from the southwest, so she paid out the main all the way to starboard and set up a preventer to avoid an accidental jibe. This preventer is kind of what this story's about today, because I suspect we all have one, and for those of us who don't, this is an example of why you should. Platino was a very big boat and equipped with 2 head sails on furlers and a mainsail with in-boom furling. This is the top dollar, spare no expense way to furl a mainsail. A lot of us don't like mainsails that furl into the mast because it means we can't have conventional battens and we lose sail shape. And the furlings in mast have been known to jam sometimes, making it very difficult to douse the main. But an in-boom furling has a much better track record and means you can still have excellent mainsail shape. The joys of furling with less of the compromises. In-boom furling means you have a very big boom with an opening at the top, and Platino's boom was massive, 28 feet long and near 1,500 pounds, a giant. As they sailed Platino north on the ocean passage, the wind from the south picked up, with 2-meter waves from the south fighting a 3-meter swell from the north, so it got kind of bumpy. They of course rigged a preventer to make sure that the boom was secured against an accidental jibe. They ran from a pad eye on the boom, that's meant for the job, down to a block and pad eye on the tow rail, and then had intended to run the preventer line back to the cockpit. Now, I don't do this myself. My preventer is a 3-to-1 that just runs down to the tow rail. It's never occurred to me to run the tail of that back to the cockpit, but I don't have a 66-foot boat. The line turned out to not be long enough to get all the way to the cockpit winch when they had tried to extend it back there. A knot was tied to the tail into another line, and then it was run to the winch. The autopilot on Platino was a hydraulic with a ram acting on the quadrant, as you'd expect, but it had in the past had an issue and it was leaking fluid. Now that issue was fixed at the time, and they sailed along on the autopilot with the preventer fixed through the night as the winds grew to 30 and then 35 knots, gusting to 48. There's a lot more to this story. They changed course a few times to keep the wind on the back port corner of the boat, and they planned to change directions later in the day when the wind was forecasted to shift to avoid a possible jibe. And they planned to do a complete about face and tack through the powerful winds instead of jibing, but skipping to the end, the autopilot turned out to be leaking again, and eventually, and surprisingly, as no one knew it was about to fail, it stopped working and the boat suddenly jibed. Now, the 1,500-pound, near 30-foot boom came screaming across the boat as the preventer let go. What we later found out was that the line they used to extend it was the failing point. The 2 lines knotted together ended up letting go. And while that's scary enough, this is just the beginning of that trauma. The autopilot had locked the steering when it failed, and the boat jibed a second time. 1,500 pounds of boom came screaming across a second time. In the commotion, the crew, of course, sprung into action and started to move around the boat to try to get back into control. The boom jibed again, and then again. What happens next is scary and the very worst case scenario. I want to express our absolute respect for those on board as we visit this story, so we're not using names or placing blame on anyone. The boom collided with one of the crew members, striking his head, and he died instantly. The boom jibed again and again, eventually ripping the traveler car right from the boat. As you can imagine, the traveler on a 1,500-pound boom is a pretty big arrangement and quite heavy. As the boom continued to jibe, now it swung the wrecking ball of a main sheet with the traveler car attached to it all over the boat. The cockpit table was hit and torn apart, being thrown overboard. The hardtop was smashed and it was thrown overboard. And eventually another crew member went overboard. The remaining people on board scrambled to get into control of things, and whatever ground they did make was later crippled further as the damage from the swinging boom had compromised some of the rigging, and the backstay failed. Failures then cascaded through the rigging, and the mast came down. Through the night, they worked to secure the vessel, all while trying to track that man overboard and make calls for help. The New Zealand Air Force had a plane circling overhead, and rescue was on the way as the mast was scraping and banging into the side of the hull. They used a cordless grinder to cut some of the rigging free. The steering was jammed, and they had no control of the boat. And then it started taking on water. All was lost. A freighter arrived first and took Platino alongside. In the swell and waves, though, she crashed into the hull. So after they rescued the people, they had to cut her loose. Later, she'd be found and towed to land, but the man overboard was never found. Now, Platino was an excellent vessel and her crew very well qualified for the passage at hand. But what started as a tiny problem cascaded so fast that everything that could go wrong did, and then some. Kudos, of course, to the rescue crew and everyone involved there. And if you want to read this whole story, it's pretty easy to find online. But what I learned from this was a cautionary tale of how my boat is actually set up, how much I can trust the autopilot, which is basically zero already, and how I rig my preventer and how I might do it better. Mine goes from a pad eye on the boom, which I genuinely have never inspected. It runs down to the tow rail, which I know to be strong, but I've never inspected the 3-to-1 blocks on either end. I don't check the line for wear or fraying. I genuinely pay little to no attention to my preventer setup until I need it. It's like a fire extinguisher. I know where it is, and if I need it, I'll use it, but I'm just assuming that it'll work, and that's where I'm wrong. I'll be adding that to my maintenance checklist. What other things are commonly forgotten in our inspections of our boats? What have you had break that you really didn't see coming? I can't wait to hear from you in the comments. Also, Practical Sailor is looking for talent. If you want to make some money creating content for the sailing community, we'd love to hear from you over at practical-sailor.com/apply. I'll see you guys next time.